Hey, here's a question for you. What is a writer? What does a writer look like, sound like, think like? Today, do I have an answer for you? We have a writer extraordinaire, personal friend, and wonderful writer. My name is Vin Dacquino, and today, unbelievably, we have Janus Adams. Janus.
Hi, Vinny.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
It's so great to be here for your show.
We need to tell our audience exactly who you are, what you do. You have a long line of credits. We need to cover as much of that as we can, and we need to help our audience understand what exactly it means to be a writer.
Well,
Talk to me about some of your history. You have a long, wonderful history.
you know, I think sometimes what people have to do is to give themselves, for me, the arc was long in terms of giving myself permission to call myself a writer. So we can talk about that too.
Okay.
But I come to my writing, I actually started life thinking I was going to be a concert pianist, and that's what I did from the age of 3.
Wow.
And trained to be a pianist, went to the High School of Performing Arts in New York City as a pianist, actually went to graduate school that way, studied composition that way. But at a certain point, I started writing. And then my mother said, but you always were writing. You were writing in, pre-K you were writing. You were doing little poems. You were doing cheat sheet newspapers that told things that the family did not want to have told, so I never thought of it that way. But I came to, it's interesting because when I finally got my voice as a writer and said, I'm going to write, not just be a newscaster, not just be a journalist, not just, write my news copy, but be a writer of books and other information came from need. And you never underestimate the power of a parent, a mother. Mm-hmm. And in my case, I was watching really negative things happening in terms of my young twin daughters when they were in nursery school. They were 3. And we'd had an incident where I realized that the books that they were being given, had such ingrained bigotry.
Wow.
And not necessarily, our first encounter wasn't because they were African American children, it was because I realized the incident specifically. Their elder brother had a best friend who was Native American, which wasn't really an important thing. He was simply the best friend. His name was Lauren. And these 2 big brothers were the best babysitters for these 2 little girls until one day the girls saw Lauren come in the house, and instead of, running and jumping and smothering him the way they did, they literally looked at him, they shrieked, and they fled. And we had no idea, what is this? But we believed in all of the children enough to say, let's not jump to any conclusions. Mm-hmm. 3-year-olds, it takes them a while to get the language. Here we are talking about early writing,
Yep.
But the language to be able to tell you what it is. And when they finally said what it was, they said that something had clicked for them. And they said that Lauren was Indian, and Indians are bad, Mommy, they're bad. And we said, where did you get that? And when we traced it back, they had just started a so-called authentic Native American unit in their nursery school.
Wow.
And we lived in Deerfield, Massachusetts, right down the road from Deerfield, Massachusetts. We lived at Amherst at the time. And literally the pollution, intellectual pollution, the toxic material that was in their nursery school books. And so I, at that point, was at NPR. I was a correspondent. I was their arts correspondent. I opened the New York News Bureau for NPR. And I decided that I would use some of those skills that I had to create something else. And so I decided to go on location to real people in real places, to interview them, and then to write about them. And that became a radio series, What is a Writer? I was writing the radio series first, and I took it then, by that time the girls were in 2nd grade, I took it to their 2nd grade teacher and said, what do you think about it? And before I knew it, the CD, at that point it was a cassette, had traveled all the way up to 6th grade. And I mean, you're in education, so you know, each teacher took what was relevant to her grade, whether it was social studies and early development of community or whatever it was, right up. But I realized, and they told me, you have something, you need to do something. So ultimately, the Backpacks series, which we'll talk about later, came from that. But from that route, I realized I had not been writing for adults, and the training of that on-location primary source research for children led me to writing for adults.
So the children's writing came first for
It
you?
actually came first.
You know, I never realized that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Or I will say the publishing for children came
right.
first. And then my books for adults came later.
And now your show that you did, that you talked about.
Well, when I first was doing this, I mean, I had started many years earlier before that, and I had done my own radio show and was doing radio shows for NPR. Segments were being picked up and aired nationally. And then I came to NPR as their arts correspondent.
Now, you received an Emmy.
I was very fortunate in my very first television show, actually, as a production assistant.
Wow.
who, when Metro Media Channel 5 went on this 20-week strike, the question was, everybody had to do something else, and the producer and executive producer said, you really are a writer. You don't write, but you really are. So you start writing the scripts. The other production assistant was working camera. Sorry about that, guys. And in New York, we were union. But I got a chance to write, and the show won an Emmy, and I was awarded a special Emmy for having written all those shows, coming to it as a production assistant.
Wow.
So one never knows when
that's right. The talent. I mean, I've said it a dozen times. You never know what you can do until you do it.
And they always say it is better to be prepared when the opportunity comes and have the opportunity come and not be prepared. So I was fortunate that I had been prepared. By that time I had a master's degree. I had, even though I was a production assistant, and that was our entree into television at that point. But I already had a master's degree. I already had written plays, and I had already, done other things relating to writers. Still not, my dissertation, all of that kind of stuff, but still not admitting Janus Adams is a writer, that kind of thing. But when the need came to do something for my children and to change really the texture, the information and misinformation that was being pumped informationally or misinformationally into their bloodstream, their life bloodstream, that's what made me pick up the pen and become the writer.
What I do too. Sybil Ludington, The Call to Arms,
yes,
is all about misinformation.
Yes.
And in that case, it's historical, and it drives me crazy.
And neglect and omission.
Yes.
The sin of omission
Yes.
is Sybil Ludington's story.
Yes.
And I was so thrilled when I drove over to studio, I passed Ludingtonville Road.
Yeah, there you go.
I said, I know about that because of Vin Dacquino.
Yeah, and it's important that you write from passion. It's also important that you write from knowledge and need. The need to say something. Now that brings me to a magnificent book. Freedom Days.
Thank you.
Wow. Tell us about Freedom Days.
Well, thanks so much. I actually have written now 3 books in the series that you're picking up, Freedom Days. It began with a book called Glory Days, in which I had done this panoramic 4,000-year history, African American history. And when that book came out, and that was a wonderful experience, once again, what is a writer? You began. Yeah. I wrote this 400-page book, and McDonald's picked it up and made a McDonald's
the McDonald's hamburger chain.
The hamburger
Wow.
chain picked it up and made this McDonald's Presents Glory Days campaign that ran for 2 years. And instead of the 400-page book, I became known for a little 24-page pamphlet based on this 400-page book, thanks to McDonald's. So after I did that, the editor said to me, well, what are you going to do next? And we had found that the Gulf, even though here we were doing this panoramic history and saying, no, you don't just begin in slavery, you begin back here and you go all the way to here, what we were still coming out of, and in fact still are dealing with in this country, was the civil rights era, and people didn't really have a good sense of the civil rights era.
What year are we talking?
Well, the year that the book is published was 98, but when Freedom Days as a book, I decided to understand the civil rights era in context as part of a global movement for freedom and independence, which really begins in 1936. My book begins in 1936, when the last African country that still has not been colonized is Ethiopia. The Emperor Haile Selassie goes to the League of Nations. He is an independent nation, and they scoff at him and say, who are you? And we'll let the Italians, take you over. And he says no, but that is the moment that galvanizes the attention of Africa and Asia to say, this day of colonialism and colonization is over. So from Freedom Days deals with the period from 1936 to 1976, when the last country still to become independent is South Africa.
Wow.
And the civil rights era is captured in that, because we look at the civil rights era and we come up with buzzwords and high points. Dr. King, of course, Dr. King was important, but what brings Dr. King, this young, bright, brilliant, recent PhD graduate student, to the fore was a woman named Rosa Parks, who says, I am not going to give over my seat to racism one more time. But what makes Rosa Parks say that? We have this mythology about this woman, her feet were tired. That is nonsense. It is an insult to her. She had studied passive resistance for years at the Highlander School. This was her moment, because what she says is, she says, I thought of Emmett and I said no more. And she's referring to the lynching of a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till.
Oh boy, I remember that.
And when Emmett Till is killed, we talk about it as though it's in isolation, but it isn't. Emmett Till is killed in 1955, and what is happening there is school desegregation is about to begin. And Emmett Till has shown in his wallet pictures of his schoolmates in Chicago, and among them is a teenage white girl that he is in his class. And that is really what prompts these crazy people to decide. In fact, they said he was, one of his killers says, he's already going after this girl, why let him get any bigger? That's what prompts the lynching. So, we go back and back and back, and all of us stand on the shoulders of someone else. You
know a great deal about segregation, and you know a great deal about breaking into those schools.
It is very intimate as a part of my life, because right after, on the day that Rosa Parks goes to court in Birmingham,
right,
my grandmother is going to court in New York.
Wow.
To become a citizen. She is pledging allegiance to a country that is denying both her and Mrs. Parks the rights that they are promising her. And so my grandmother and my mother and father pledged their children, these immigrant parents pledged their children, my cousin and me, and then there were two other children, to the freedom movement as baby foot soldiers in this in the school desegregation movement. And the following February, we are there are four of us: Bobby Burns, Linda Scott, Ted Landsmark, and myself, who become the test children for New York City, which led the northern part of the nation.
So you were one of the original four
in school desegregation for the North.
Wow.
And in fact, it's interesting because many people don't realize we talk so much about the South and desegregation. We never talk about the North. In the South, it was de jure, by law. In the North, it was de facto, in fact. And so the fact of our, quote, neighborhood school plans was, well, if your neighborhoods are segregated, your schools are too. So that's where we began.
So after Freedom Days,
after Freedom Days, people said, well, you know, hey, the woman's story. One of the things that is really missing when we talk about the civil rights movement is we only mention Rosa Parks. What about all the other women? Sister Days, I was thrilled to write because it is a history of African American women going as far back as, once again, more panoramic, dealing with the era on the continent, in Africa, and bringing us right up until the year 2000 in terms of African American women.
Now, you had quite a journey for yourself to create your own identity, to become who you are. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think you're alluding to my marriage.
Yeah.
Well,
because it's a big thing that you had to get your own identity and be who you are.
You know, the point is, well, let me just say, my husband was an extraordinary musician, Max Roach, the drummer, percussionist, composer. He was one of the early MacArthur Award winners, the MacArthur, quote, Genius Award winners. And he, I mean, when I think of Max as a musician, what just fills me with pride in him and for what he accomplished was that his music was about life. His music had a purpose. When he wrote his landmark work, the Freedom Now Suite, it was an authentic cry. It comes out in 1960, you know, launching. It is actually being written in preparation for the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is actually released on January 1st, 1863, but you know, so 1963 they're preparing for it, but he writes that as the commemoration, and he knows what it means to have to raise an outcry for freedom.
Right, and he did, and that's why I want to make it clear that you are your own woman.
Well, you know, sometimes you forget, and life says you better remember. And so I had the history that I had, you know, as a child. Only now, wasn't raised thinking I was a prodigy, but only now people are saying, come on, get a grip. You were playing the piano at 3. You were, you know, I started college at 16. So, but that's what you did. It wasn't about putting labels. It was about life. This is the life I know. And then started television. And when I was in television and already had won that Emmy, is when I met Max. And we became very active together as a couple politically. We have our twin daughters. He had 3 older children from previous marriages, and his middle son, Raul, came to live with us. And it's indeed Raul who's friend I began talking about, Lauren, at the beginning of the program, but our twins, Io and Dara. And then at a certain point, you know, I think many people on many levels can identify with it. You kind of, our whole house was our profession. I mean, we both worked from home. I continued to work as a journalist, and I was married to Max when I was a national, you know, news correspondent. But at the same point, there came a time when I had to remember, you know, my own life.
That's right.
And as a writer, and different skills, and bring that back to the fore. Some of which he encouraged, some of which he discouraged. And I have to be honest about that.
We have had some wonderful lunches.
Yes.
When you talked about your memoirs, putting it all together, I can't wait till that's done and ready and in my hand.
Me too.
But also, while you're doing that, you're also close to my heart in understanding the need for children.
Absolutely.
And you were creating, you are the founder of Backpacks for Children.
Yes,
Tell me about your work for children.
All right. Well, I mentioned that the genesis of it being
Right.
in there. And then I decide, well, I'm going to do something, but I'm not sure what I'm going to do. And every time true to the story, the first tape was on the Tonawanda Senecas of upstate New York.
Oh, wow.
And the National Endowment for the Arts came in with a grant for us to do it. And all of a sudden, though, that was one of those fallow periods where funding dried up and people were still saying, but you've got to do it, you've got to do it. And finally, dear friends came in and said they would put up some of the money. I put up some of the money, and I put up the work. And I created a company called Backpacks, Adventure for the Child Who's Going Places. And I remember when I was delayed on a flight between just to Nantucket, where I was going to go do some research on the early, Nantucket is such an extraordinary place.
Yes.
In terms of history. And I got stuck and I kept saying, we didn't have a name for the company yet. Hadn't gotten its Backpacks name. It was still the Children's Radio Project. And I remember being in the bathtub and breaking out laughing and saying, well, every child needs a backpack. And they all have their backpack. And so we began to create our signature little mini backpacks. And from there, the image of this travel and adventure for the child who's going places. So what makes Backpacks unique, from the very beginning, we always did our audios on location, true to that story, so that real people would get to tell their stories in real places. We have done now 10 titles in the series.
Wow.
I've done Cajun Country. Phenomenal experience going out into the Gulf of Mexico with the Cajuns. We also put a book component next to it.
Okay.
And here's the Cajun book.
Ah, okay.
And in each case...
Let me get this on this camera here.
Okay.
There you go.
And in each case, I remember when we went into the Gulf of Mexico and the Cajuns, people were so astounded because we have to remember, yes, we celebrate Cajun food, but the Cajuns are maligned people.
Yes.
They're a wonderful, rich culture, but they are maligned people. I chose the Cajuns as the first book and audio because the word is not a pleasant word, but they were always called the white niggers.
Really?
In that very disparaging way. These were French-Canadian people who were expelled by the British from Canada, and they came down the coast and they settled in Louisiana, and the Acadians migrated and in terms of both distance and lineage, and became the Cajuns that we know of today. And so we wanted to present their rich history, their culture, the fishing. You're going out into the Gulf of Mexico with the shrimpers. We go to a Cajun fado dough, and all of our titles are done like that, so that if we were talking about adults, we'd say anthropology, but because we're talking to children, we say storytelling.
Right.
Mark Twain's America, we did. Mark Twain, living in Connecticut at the time with my children, honestly, I wasn't the only one. Other people of every race and demographic were sick of this business of, in order to preserve one of our great writers, who was a great writer for his imagination, but it was insulting to constantly have this racial slur in the name of teaching children. And there was so much more about this wonderful man to know. And I happened to know a little bit of it. And said, well, why do we have to freeze him 25 years before his prime if we want to really celebrate this wonderful man? And I grew to, I had visited his home in Hannibal so many times to do the taping that I had to stop going. I developed such a love of him that I missed him every time I went. And it was very difficult because he was so alive for me. We went to Hannibal, Missouri, and as we're in Hannibal doing the taping for the audio, in comes Mark Twain on the top of the Mississippi Delta riverboat, and it's a wonderful, wonderful man named Bill McClin, who was an extraordinary Mark Twain impersonator, whose mind was like, oh my goodness, it was definitely a computer. When you would ask him, we went into studio in NPR studio in Washington, and we turned away from each other, and I did a live interview with Mark Twain. That was an extraordinary interview with Mark Twain and Bill McClin's retelling, and so he's on the tape. But what you find with this amazing author that is worth talking about in a show about writing is the imagination, the imagery, this metaphor of us all being in the same boat, which is what.
Well, we are unfortunately in like the last 2 minutes of our show. Time flies when you're having fun.
Or as Jim Henson, a family friend, would say, time's fun when you're having flies for Kermit the Frog.
There you go. Final words for our audience.
You know, I think what we've done with the shows, we've talked about this experience of writing. One never knows where it will take you, but
Right.
It is storytelling. I brought with me also some games.
Okay.
And this that we have on set is a game that I did for the Casey Foundation. You may not be able to pull it up, but
Let me go.
and
here we
then we're going to talk about another game very quickly that we have on camera below. This one I was asked to tell the story about how to empower communities, and I did it as a board game so that people could be engaged.
How do people get these games?
Please, what you can do for everything that I've done, write me. Order my books through www.janusadams.com and
www.janusadams.com.
and my name is Janus Adams. Storytelling right there. It's for January.
Well, Janus Adams, what a pleasure to have you here.
Vin Dacquino,
You are
thank you.
a friend and a gift to society.
And you are a gift for bringing writers this wonderful opportunity.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. It has been a pleasure to be with you today. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. Tune in again and again. Thank you for joining us.